David Axelrod is a former senior advisor to President Barack Obama. He is currently director of the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics and host of the Axe Files podcast, which is jointly produced by CNN and his institute. David's a veteran of politics and journalism. He's a former political writer for the Chicago Tribune and developed media strategies behind 150 state, local, and national campaigns. He's also the author of the New York Times best-selling memoir, Believer, My 40 Years in Politics, which I've just read, and it's terrific.
Thank you.
So, and I recommend it to you all. The Honorable Karl Rove served as senior advisor to President George W. Bush from 2000 to 2007, and deputy chief of staff from 2004 to 2007. He was known as the architect of President Bush's 2000 and 2004 campaigns, and previously worked for Republican candidates, nonpartisan causes, and nonprofit groups. Today, Karl writes a weekly op-ed for the Wall Street Journal, is a Fox News contributor, and the author of the newly published book, The Triumph of William McKinley, Why the Election of 1896 Still Matters. And John Madigan told me he's just read it, and that's terrific. And I'm happy to say I just read.
Read.
Yeah. I just
Available
read.
for $19.16 on Amazon.
At Amazon? All right, okay.
If you, get, you can go for $25.55 and get the package deal, his book.
Okay, I'm in trouble. They're stand up already. Okay. So both of these gentlemen have something in common with many of us who are in the room today. They are lost survivors. But something struck me when I was thinking about this panel, which is that where we all are today is what we should call common ground. And it's something that we are bringing to the Hill tomorrow, and that we're going to talk about in every office we visit, because mental health has no party. It does not discriminate, let's put it that way. And so what we're going to do is ask them to tell us their stories, and then we're going to ask them for their advice on how we should talk when we're on the Hill tomorrow. Just so you know, we've heard a lot already in terms of briefing folks so they're prepared. We're talking about health care. We're talking about the issues that are really important for preserving mental health in the United States. The most recent panel was just about research and where we are on that and how much more we need for the brain. But I'm going to stop there and ask you both to start by telling us your stories.
Well, thanks. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I really appreciate being here with Karl. You know, there are a couple of things on which we don't agree. But
I'm hard-pressed to think what they are, but I'm sure there are.
Yeah, this isn't the place to bring them up, probably. But I really have such affection and admiration for him personally. And the one thing I learned when I read his autobiography is that we had this terrible experience in common. When I was 19 years old, I was a student at the University of Chicago, and I lived off campus in an apartment that was called Happy House. I will leave. It was the 70s, but you can imagine why it was named that. And there was a knock on the door, and my roommate opened the door, and there was a Chicago police officer, and he said he needed to speak with me, and my roommate was reluctant to let him in, and I told my roommate, no, let him in. And this officer's name was Gardner, came into the darkened corridor of my apartment, and he asked me if I was David Axelrod. I said yes. He said, "Is your father Joseph Axelrod?" And I knew right away that something terrible had happened, and I said yes. And he said, I have some very sad news for you. Your father is dead. I lived in New York, and he said, we heard from the New York City police, and they need you to go home and identify the body. My parents were divorced, and he said, and I said, what happened? And he said, well, it appears it was a suicide. And it was stunning to me because, first of all, my father was a mental health professional. He was a psychologist. But secondly, he was also my best friend, and whenever I had any need or any problem in my life, he was the first guy that I went to, and he was always there for me. And he would never, expect in return that I should be there for him. He wouldn't want to burden me with his problems. It was only in reflecting that I thought about different cues that I should have picked up on, including the last conversation we ever had, in which he said, you know, I know now that you and your sister are going to do very well in life, and I'm really proud of you. And I thought that was an odd thing. But I mean, I was happy to hear it, but it was an odd thing to say in the middle of a conversation, and I realized in retrospect that he was saying goodbye. And I'm sure, as many of you feel, it is one of the great regrets of my life that I didn't have a chance to say goodbye to him and tell him what he meant to me. And I didn't talk about this publicly for 30 years. And on Father's Day in 2006, I decided to write an op-ed about my father because I realized the same reason that I didn't talk to it for 30 years was the reason that he didn't go and get the help that he needed, even though he was trained. But he in some way felt there was a stigma attached to it. And he was in that dark, dark tunnel that's so hard to escape, even though he helped many people get out of the tunnel. One of the interesting, moving things about his funeral were the number of patients of his who came to say that he had saved their lives, and yet he couldn't save his own life. And you know, I'm here today because I believe that the way, first of all, I'm pleased to sit next to Carl because this is something that transcends partisanship, and it reminds us that we at the end of the day, we're not Republicans or Democrats, we're not even Americans, we're human beings, and we share a common humanity. And you know, I've also had the experience in my life of having a very sick child who has epilepsy, which is another of the causes of my life. And what I learned from telling her horrific story is that the way we move people is to share our stories. And so I just wanted to come and tell you how important and meaningful it is that you're willing to share your stories with people who will make significant decisions about whether there'll be the availability of mental health services that are so essential to try and save other people's loved ones. And you can't do anything more powerful than that. So I'm here to be one of you and share my story.
Thank you. Carl, would you do the same?
Thanks. First of all, thanks for having us. It's funny, David and I had heard of each other over the years, but never been in contact with each other until I wrote a White House memoir and wrote about something in the memoir that I never anticipated writing about. When I finished the manuscript and turned it in, my editor, a brilliant woman whom David knows, Priscilla Payton,
Yes.
said to me, "You're missing stuff." She said, "You show up in this book at the age of 21, and people need to sort of know who you are, and they need to know about some things." And one of the things she said was, you know, here are the unpleasant things that people have said about your mother's suicide. You need to write about your mother's suicide. And some, you know, sort of strange to have 4 biographies written about you, but at this point 4 biographies had been written, and some people had said some ugly things about my parents, like David's, were divorced. They separated on Christmas Eve, 1969, the day before my birthday. And what was amazing to me was I later found out, at least my father, and I think my mother, never stopped being in love with each other, but they, for reasons of complex human needs and values, ended up not being able to be with each other. And 12 years later, ironically enough, on September 11th, a day that seems to haunt me in lots of different ways, my mother committed suicide. And in retrospect, you could sort of see why. I suspect today, knowing what we know about things, that there had been a pill or a mental health regime that could have saved her, but it was 1981, and people didn't talk about suicide, and people didn't talk as much about their needs and their feelings, and they didn't get off the warning signs, and there weren't groups of people and communities all across the country who could recognize those signs and help somebody do something about it. But her marriage, her subsequent marriage, third marriage, had just come apart after literally 4 months, and she was literally left bankrupt. Her then husband had taken out not only a second but a third mortgage on her house, and then had basically pillaged everything of value, literally down to the silverware. My childhood stamp collection and coin collection disappeared from the box in the garage. And she was at the bottom. And she was about ready to turn 51, and all that she'd wanted in life seemed to have been gone. But I got a really plucky younger sister, and she had taken my mom, and together they'd sat down and made out a plan. My little sister is a very methodical person, and they had literally found a friend who said, you can use my guest house, and a friend who said, you know, I've got a car I was going to discard, you're welcome to it. And they had sort of made up this plan of how my mom would be able to sort of pick herself up and move on. And they had breakfast, and my sister felt really good about it. And the next day, my mother took her little pickup truck and drove out into the desert north of Reno, Nevada, and took a pipe and connected it to her tailpipe and put it through the tiny window in the back of the pickup cab, and turned on the car and killed herself, and left, as many people do, a letter to try and escape responsibility, and by expressing their love and their forgiveness of their children, saddled particularly my younger siblings with a huge burden. And I didn't talk about it and write about it. I mean, my friends had little knowledge of it in the years ahead. New friends that I made didn't know that my mother had committed suicide. So when I wrote about it in this memoir, first of all, David is at the White House, and I get this email, David Axelrod at whoeop.gov, and I'm thinking, who is pranking me? And attached to it was a short note about how we shared a common experience, and this incredibly powerful eulogy that he had written about his dad, that he wrote a couple years before that. And I mean, it's just, you can Google it and it'll pop up. I can't imagine having to do that in a publication, or at least I couldn't before I wrote about my mother in the book, but it's a really powerful testimony to the relationship that he had with his father, and the experience that he went through that so many, I suspect, in this room have gone through. I have to say this, I'm glad Priscilla insisted I write about it. It was very painful to write about it, painful to talk about it today, as I suspect some of you find it painful to talk about your loss. But I will tell you this, of all that I wrote in the book, which was a New York Times bestseller.
How much can you get it for on Amazon now?
Well, it's down there, but go ahead and buy it anyway. I still get the same amount of money for each volume. But I cannot tell you, people would come up to me in airports or hotels or restaurants or on the street and say, I read your book and thank you about talking about your mother's suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's so many people who have this shared experience, and we need to embolden them. First of all, it's just good to talk about it to somebody, anybody. But the other thing is it rouses them to action. You know, look, I know you're here to talk to Washington and ask things of the government, and that's fine. And you need to do it. And I hope you're well prepared for your visit tomorrow. But one of the most powerful things that's happened in our country is this growth of these battalions, little battalions, that have organized themselves into chapters and organizations to bring this issue to greater public attention and to talk about it. Because, you know, it's like the warnings in the airport. If you see something, say something. And we've now made it more possible in our society to talk about this disease and to thereby prevent it in many respects. And you know, to think about how horrible it must have been, you know, 30 years ago or 40 years ago. To think about it in the time that my mother died. I know what a stigma there was to even talking about it, and now by talking about it, we can help people, encourage people to see the signs and to help prevent it and to deal with it and to deal with the consequences of it when we can't stop it. But anyway, thanks for what you're doing. Where are my Central Texans? I hear there we go, right in front. There we go. Thanks for doing what you do.
I just want to underscore one thing that Carl said. When I wrote that piece, I've written a lot. I was a journalist, and I've written a lot and said a lot on the public record. Nothing I have ever written provoked as strong a response as that particular column. And some of the letters were truly poignant, not just from people who have experienced that loss, but from people who are going through depression or whose loved ones were going through depression, who just said thank you for talking about it. You know, so I just want to underscore what Carl said. This is a disease. Mental illness is an illness, and we need to talk openly about it and embolden others to talk openly about it, because again, you know, the most powerful cudgel you have are your stories, and those are going to make a huge difference.
Yeah. Not to drag us.
I think we have the piece on our website, don't we?
Yeah.
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
Yes, and I just want to say on behalf of all these people, they're bold.
Yeah,
good.
well, clearly, and that's great. You guys are heroic.
Yeah. Not to dwell on this too much, but one of the things that President Bush is doing at his center in Dallas is warrior wellness programs.
Yes.
And one of the most important parts of this is dealing with PTS. You'll notice I left off the D. This is a disease that we're dealing with, not a disorder. And we need to, particularly when it comes to our wounded warriors, remove the stigma that causes a lot of people who are facing pressures that could ultimately lead them down this dark path, to recognize that it is something that's treatable and that they can deal with it. Not that it's a disorder, not that it's something fundamentally wrong with them, but something that they need to ask for help with. And one of the exciting things is to listen to the people with the Warrior Wellness effort at the Bush Presidential Library talk about the large number of groups all across the country that are helping confront PTS among our warriors in order to deal with this skyrocketing suicide rate, which is not just, we got to be careful. The scary thing is it's not limited or even primarily among people who are Iraq and Afghan war veterans. We're dealing with the invisible wounds from Vietnam and Korea and from conflicts long ago. And the recognition that this is something that people need to confront and help others confront is really important.
You know, we train these service people, men and women, to face all kinds of pressures, to be stoic in the face of danger, and in a sense you have to undo some of that. And so, you know, it's okay to seek help. It's okay to acknowledge this problem.
Definitely. I want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please write them on an index card and hold them up, and our staff will collect them. A couple things that we wanted to ask your opinion about. We're going up to the Hill tomorrow in a kind of interesting time.
Really, what's happening?
Can you tell when there's a pro on the stage, right? And so we know that I'm from Massachusetts, okay, so there are a bunch of people from Massachusetts we're going to go see who will probably be in favor of several of the things that we're going to propose or that we'd like to see in the next health care bill. But there will be places where we go where the conversation will be a little more difficult. We have practicing identifying ourselves, telling our stories briefly, but do you have any specific suggestions for us right now at this time?
Yeah. Look, first of all, keep it nonpartisan or bipartisan.
Right.
This is an issue that cannot be caught up in partisanship. And don't give answers that you don't need to give answers to. One question you're going to get is, well, where is this money going to come from? That's not up to you. And out of a $4.1 trillion federal budget, surely there's something that's less important than this, if need be. And third, I'm glad you're here, contributing to the, hotel, motel receipts of Washington, sales tax receipts from dinners, maybe some tickets on tourist buses. But the day tomorrow is not as important as the day after when you go home. It's one thing to go see your member up here. It's even more powerful if our friends from Central Texas show up at Congressman Carter's town hall meeting in Round Rock, or Congressman Doggett's town hall meeting in South Austin, or Mike McCall's meeting in West Austin, or Lamar Smith's meeting in New Braunfels, and do it consistently with different faces, different voices, and the same message. Look, they every day, every week that they're in session, except when it is really bad weather or really hot in the summer, there will be people like you coming to Washington, the auto dealers or the farm implement people or the good cause this and the even better cause that.
And the bad cause that.
And the bad cause that. But what will really have an impact is to make certain that this issue is raised whenever your member is at home, whether it's an open town hall meeting or a listening session or simply office hours. And don't be afraid of, if you walk into that and it's not the congressman or congresswoman but the staffer, talk to the staffer as well, because there are 435 members of Congress, but they don't make decisions without the help of about 12 or 13 or 15,000 staff members. So sort of scary that there are that many of them, but on the other hand, everybody needs a little help. So great that you're here tomorrow for your visits on the Hill, but that's just training day.
Yeah, no, I thoroughly agree with everything that Carl said. I also was impressed by your fact sheets, the cost of mental illness and the cost of some of these problems also ought to be measured against the cost of dealing with them. Right. Are there any Illinoisans here? I know there's at least,
yes.
Plenty.
Yeah.
One of the stunning things on that fact sheet is that nearly twice as many people in Illinois die of suicide than homicide. We've gotten a lot of publicity lately, sadly, for particularly in Chicago, some of the things that are going on there. I mean, that was a sort of stunning statistic. So you're well armed with information that you also ought to share.
Yes, and the other thing that we're doing, we talked about this earlier today, we have a partnership with the National Shooting Sports Foundation, and they represent retailers, gun dealers, trainers, all sorts of folks, and we're partnering with them around gun safety, and we have a great brochure, which we can give you on your way out, about that. So, because we want, as we go to, guns are responsible for more than 50% of suicides. So we want to partner with that industry, with folks who love guns, who use them all the time, to make sure that people understand there's a time to remove the gun from the house when there's someone at risk. So that's something we've been careful to go over because we think it could be potentially a difficult conversation in some offices.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you probably had a sense of that could be a little ticklish. I mean,
Hell yes, I'm from Texas.
Yes.
So the other issue that we think is we're likely to face, we have 85 chapters in 50 states, small, large states, small chapters, large ones. Illinois, I would be happy to tell you, is the largest walk fundraiser in the country. Illinois, right? Yes. Texas is a newer chapter, but it's racing to catch up, right? Yeah.
You guys do everything big down there.
So
we got a lot to be big with.
So the other thing that we're thinking may well happen is a lot of this, or some issues, may devolve to the states. And so you've both run campaigns in states, and I presume some of your advice would be similar to what you said about going home, Carl, and talking to your legislator at home.
Yeah, remember, regulation of insurance is principally a state responsibility.
Right.
And if you look back, mental health parity was first done at state levels before Denny Hastert came along and made it a cause in the Congress.
Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely. And look, the other thing is that people, I think, make a mistake saying, let's put it all on Washington. Because it makes any organization that becomes Washington-centric in its nature ultimately loses one of its most important missions, which is education, which can only be done effectively in a decentralized, nationwide but decentralized way.
Yeah, I would. Legislators are, by definition, a little closer to their communities, And so your stories, it seems to me, are even more powerful because they're very much neighbors in ways, not to denigrate members of Congress, but they spend an awful lot of time here. And legislators often are much more accessible. So, and it may be, we'll see where they go on health care, but there may well be much more of a role for the states to play.
Oops, sorry, thank you. Yeah, so, okay. In our state, partisanship is a huge problem. How can we best approach this issue, in both of your opinions, in a time where speaking across the aisle, even for private citizens, is a difficult task? I think, Carl, you started to address that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, I may be wrong about this, but my sense is the country is at a point where it's sick and tired of the hyper-partisanship. And where particularly,
I think you knew you weren't wrong about that.
yeah. And I think particularly even among legislators, I get the sense that there's a desire. I know it's here in Washington. Sure, there's some people who are happy to, pull the pin on the grenade and throw it at the other side. But I think there are a lot of people who came here and said, is this what I came here to do? And I know this is true in our state capitals. I just want to brag on our state of Texas. Our politics in Texas is a blood sport. I mean, high school football and politics. But this may blow your mind. We have a highly partisan political environment, but we organize our legislature on a nonpartisan basis. In the state House of Representatives, there are 99 Republicans and 51 Democrats. When I moved to Texas, there were 13 Republicans and 137 Democrats. We didn't organize it on a partisan basis back then. I worked for the senior Republican in the House who'd been a committee chairman. Today, they're Democrat committee chairman in a House in which they've got 1/3 of the members. We have a 31-member state Senate. We got more members of Congress than we have state senators, 20 Republicans, 11 Democrats, and the chairman of 4 major committees in the Senate are Democrats. So we can be partisan, but we do things on a nonpartisan basis in many instances because we place an emphasis on it. And even if your legislature is organized on a partisan basis, I bet you have allies on both sides of the aisle that would like to find a constructive way to work together, and you ought to encourage that. You can encourage it by the way that you make this an issue and by the people that you bring to the table. I always have people who look as weird as the two of us sitting next to each other.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I'm sure there are Democrats and Republicans in this room, and to the extent that you can pair up and go see members on a bipartisan basis, I think that's a wise thing to do. So, buddy up with someone of the other party on your lobbying
thank you.
forays.
Okay.
If you do, though, you got to avoid one thing that I've found over since I've gotten to know David, which is really important, and that is the guy has a magnetic personality, and my wife refers to him as her boyfriend. Now, this is really troubling. I mean,
Just
the last
trying to do
words,
my part.
I'm talking to her. I'm talking to her this morning, and she says, "Have you seen my boyfriend yet?" I said, "We'll talk about this when I get home."
Don't forget to give her that gift, I said.
Not until I open it first.
Okay, if I can read, as sage political gurus, if we hired you both to devise a strategy to make sure the public officials finally understand that suicide is the 10th cause of death in the USA, what's the strategy you would use? In many states, it is the second leading cause of death for 10 to 14-year-olds. Yeah. So we're asking for free advice, obviously.
I don't have the answer to it, but I think it has to do with, again, what you're doing. 85 chapters in 50 states. It wouldn't be great to have 185 chapters in 50 states. Mm-hmm. Because the more this message gets out, the more that people are willing to share their stories, the more that we personalize this, and the more we take it out of politics, the better off we are. Think about all the great sort of reform movements that have swept through our country. Whether it was women's suffrage in the 1900s and the 1910s, whether it was abolition in the 1840s and the 1850s, temperance movement, whatever these great social movements are, it's because they operate largely outside of partisan politics. And when they do operate inside partisan politics, and when they become concentrated, they tend to become less effective. So the more the merrier.
I agree with that. When I sent that email to Carl, I said, you and I, we should speak together on this issue because, I think people think it's unusual for us to speak together, especially when we're not being paid to do it. And he was receptive to that. But I think there are probably others. There may be some sort of odd couple pairings, but other people who are well known and I think you ought to encourage those people who are well known to share their stories because, we're in a celebrity culture and that will get attention.
We are. Well, funny you should say that because this question says the two of you combined have such a powerful voice. Can you do something together besides this to help with so much at risk with health care and research funding and for suicide prevention? So thank you for being here today. And if you'd like us to send you around the country, just let us know.
That'd be okay by me, but in David's case, Allison, his deputy, is here. David is not allowed to travel without adult supervision.
Nor schedule myself. But I'm here because I'm committed. I'm willing to help. I know Carl's willing to help, and we're happy to stay in touch and do what we can.
Because one of the things we're doing actually is we're doing some PSAs around youth suicide. But the truth of it is that older white males are more
huge
problem, and and you are rock stars in that category, gentlemen. So
I don't know what that
means. I think she just called us
you
a pair
think
of
about
old
that
guys.
answer. I've got to run off to the restroom. I got to run off to the restroom for a second.
Exactly.
But this issue about particularly older men, is a manifestation of, some of the strains we have in our economy. And, I honestly my father didn't leave a note. But I know that he was struggling. Interestingly, one of the sources of tension between my father and my mother, I think it's one of the reasons that it didn't work out between them was my mother was always frustrated with my father because she thought he didn't charge his patients enough. And he always said, they've got enough problems. I don't want to give them more problems. But he came to a point in life where he was supporting my grandmother and her sister, helping me with college, helping my sister, and was really, really financially strained. And I think he felt like he was failing. Mm-hmm. And I think that sense of failure has impacted on a lot of men who've lost their jobs, who feel too old to retrain for other jobs, and feel like they haven't lived up to their mission. Yeah. And so, yes, I think this is a big focus. So, Carl and I are a little young to speak to that audience, but
I'm older than you are, so it's all right.
You wear it better, though.
Yeah. One thing about it, too, is that there's also the converse of that, which are older men who think that they have now fulfilled their responsibilities. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like, my kids are off on their own, I'm no longer of value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I've existed, and I run into this. I had this really powerful visit with a guy who showed up. I was giving a speech, and it was, let's just say, in a smaller town, and so the hotel accommodations were not exactly as nice as the Washington Court, and I was eating in the diner connected with the hotel, and a guy came in and told me about the death of his father, and it was exactly that, and it raised my interest in it, and that's more prevalent than I would have thought. Mm-hmm. His father had a reasonably successful life, and as long as he felt it was necessary for him to be there in order to provide. But when his kids were gone and his, wife seemed to be provided for, and there was a sense of, I'm no longer necessary. Yeah. And scary to think that he was sustained kept from the act for so long by keeping himself busy.
And he probably became depressed.
Yes.
Yeah. And not realize that it was curable. Because
Yeah.
25 years ago when I entered this business, we didn't say suicide was preventable because we didn't know enough, and we didn't think we could say that with assurance. And now I think we can if we intervene at the right time.
Yeah. I just can't stress enough the important fundamental truth, which is that depression, mental illness, these are not reflections of character. We just need to keep pounding that point home. I mean, my father was the most admirable person I knew. The most admirable person I knew. And whatever dark cloud descended on him was not a reflection of lack of character. It was a reflection of the fact that he had depression. It's an illness, and it killed him.
Character, but not character, but chemistry.
Yeah, that's good.
Brain
Used in
chemistry.
politics.
Yeah.
This is why he's such a good mail and ad guy.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is an interesting question which I hadn't thought about. How do we advocate for the territories, i.e. Puerto Rico and Guam? Do we approach resident commissioners, and given that they don't hold the same voting power as the states and their congressional members? I don't know if you have any expertise in this area.
Yeah, go ahead and talk to them.
Yeah.
I mean, they got to vote. They don't have, or they've got presence at minimum, and we have 56 jurisdictions. 52 of them, or actually 53 of them, have representation in Congress. 3 of them without a vote, though they have a presence. So yeah, by all means, do it. They all participate in a party caucus as well, even if they don't have a vote. Puerto Rican is. We've had the Puerto Ricans for the last 20 years. Most of the time, they caucus with the Republicans, and as a result, they become quite popular because it's a great place to go visit in the.
I mean, just as our advice is to tell our stories, we want to make sure that they're telling our stories too. So, absolutely.
But don't lose sight of the fact that if you take the population of, let's say, Guam, you got more people in probably one congressional district in your state. We got more people in, McAllen and Brownsville in Texas than we got in Guam. So, just sometimes it's nice to sort of check off all of we got Guam and Marianas, but even more important to say, how far can we grow this movement inside our state? So it's not just Chicago, but it's Rock Island and Galena and Peoria and Springfield and Normal and Champaign and Carbondale and East St. Louis.
All right, now
and
you're
so
showing
forth.
off.
Yeah. You want me to do county names too? I'm going to be happy to do that.
Well, we have a new initiative called Project 2025. It is our goal to reduce suicide 20% by 2025, and that's one of the things we're bringing to the Hill tomorrow. And we had some interesting advice earlier, which was that people on the Hill are kind of tired of hearing about disease. And what we're trying to bring them is some hope for a really positive movement. I mean, we talked a little bit about the cost of suicide and depression. And is that, you think, a strategy that would be helpful in talking to members?
Look, I think that people are, I think members are looking for metrics and what kind of return on investment they're going to get. And obviously the human dimension of this is enormous, but they're confronted with stories of human challenge and tragedy all the time. And the question they're going to ask is, what's the plan? What's the metric? What can we hope for? What can we produce?
Right.
And I think the tighter a presentation you can make on that, and obviously, as you point out, I mean, we know that there are ways to prevent suicide. There are certainly ways to treat depression. And to the degree that you can, I think, be specific about that this is not just aspirational. This is based in, really grounded assumptions about what we can accomplish given this much of an investment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, and success begets success.
Yes. Yes.
My sense is that our per capita suicide rates for some populations have declined.
Not much. Who's our fact people here?
That is true, a smidgen for elderly
Oh.
population.
Even older than I am, right?
Yeah, that's like 80, 85
Okay.
and up.
Yeah.
But for 45 to 64, it's gone up more than doubled in some cases over the last 16 years.
Well, you better find success in something, in some metric,
Yes.
people
Yeah.
served,
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
because success begets success.
I also, I'm going to stray into waters that, I'm not certain of, but I suspect, which is this increase in suicide among adolescents.
Mm-hmm.
I think adolescent girls even more than boys that are related to the social media pressures that
Yeah.
they face. And I think, most of these legislators are parents.
Mm-hmm.
And I can relate to those stories. And that, one of my great concerns about our time is that, the great proliferation and churning of technology has made lots of things possible, but it's also brought these ancillary impacts that we haven't yet gotten our arms around. And one of them is this, bullying online, the impact on these adolescents and the things they have to deal with that we never had to deal with. And so, this should add a sense of urgency to efforts to prevent suicide.
Definitely. Do we have any other questions? I don't want to ignore anybody. Okay. All right.
We've talked them into submission.
No, I think there's one.
David has a pretty good answer to the question that often comes up when we jointly appear, which is, David, why are you so darn good looking? But be happy to, if you want to answer that one.
Thank you.
That's the one I usually ask to be asked.
It's not on here, so.
It's coming.
So, following up actually on David, on what you just said, what process would you go about helping people make the stigma go away? And, that's what we're about as an organization in many ways, but you operate in different environments. Do you have any thoughts about stigma?
Well, I shared mine.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel more strongly about this than anything. It is the single greatest barrier to people getting the help they need, and to some degree, it may be a barrier to the decisions of policymakers on how much money to apportion to these programs. And this is where the storytelling helps. I think one can't hear these stories and conclude that somehow this is a character issue. It's not a character issue. So I mean, I don't have any ingenious notion beyond that, but I think that in this room is the answer to that question. But I think, as Carl said, the more chapters you create, the more you pervade communities and lock arms with others. I just know from the reaction I got to the piece I wrote that there's a whole there's a universe of people out there waiting, just hungering to be activated and validated, and that I think will help.
Good.
Yeah, it's tied. It seems to me that it's tied up with a broader issue of mental health. Are you crazy? Are you? Is this something that we should be afraid of talking about because it somehow reflects upon who we are as individuals, and it's hard to ask for help, in part because we think by asking for help we are acknowledging a defect in ourselves, and that kind of thing. It takes time. We see it in our, we've seen it in all. I suspect everybody in this room has seen it in their lifetime. I mean, we've gone from this being a taboo topic to one that we now talk about, whether it's suicide or the need for mental health assistance. And again, in some instances, it's been led by people in the private sector. How long before the government got around to this were we seeing mental health coverage and private insurance policies issued by American businesses to cover their employees?
Mm-hmm.
And it was because they recognized they had somebody worthy of dignity and respect who happened to be their employee or a family member of an employee, and that they had this gigantic resource that would be wasted unless they provided that kind of assistance. And thank God that companies and states and communities do that. But there's no magic answer. If there was a magic answer, somebody would have stumbled on it, flicked the switch, pushed the button, written the 3 lines of code necessary to do it. Instead, this requires hard work over a sustained period of time in lots of different places in the country.
This is probably an inappropriate story in a way, but I'm going to tell it anyway.
Go ahead, come on.
It's not as if we're live streaming or anything. But I have a friend, probably my closest friend from childhood, and maybe the smartest person I've ever known, and the most decent person that I've ever known. And he had reverses in his childhood. His father got caught up in something, and he got into drugs. But he obviously had an underlying condition, and he had a breakdown when we were 17, and he was diagnosed as schizophrenic, and he spent the next 25 years in and out of hospitals. And in between, he got a master's degree as a draftsman, and he became, in his community, really, really successful. And then drafting went out of fashion, and he got a master's degree in computer and software design, and became very successful at that, but always battling these issues and, having to take his medications and doing all these things to try and keep himself healthy. And we had a reunion, and it was in Massachusetts in the winter, and there was a car that was going to pick up the group, and someone said, should we wait inside or outside? And I sort of thoughtlessly said, what are you, nuts? Of course we should wait. I said, what are you, nuts? And my friend just smiled at me and said, well, yes, but that's another story. And of course, that just accentuated, his self-awareness was so disarming and so beautiful. And he's one of the most heroic people that I know.
Mm-hmm. Well, the last question I'm going to pose to you is about the relationship, the focus right now on opioids, and how, if there's some way to tie mental health and suicide prevention to the interest in the opioid crisis. Now, we know we don't have solid statistics. We know there's some percentage of overdoses that are probably suicides, but I don't think we know yet what percentage that is. And there's a lot of attention, a lot of states around the nation. There's been a lot of money invested to save these lives, but it's a little hard for us to look at some of that money going there when we know it could be invested, or a similar amount of money could be invested in the kinds of issues we need to invest in research on. Are we missing an opportunity? What do you think?
Keep it simple.
Yeah.
Your credibility is really, really important. And if you don't know, if you only have evidence of a tenuous link, don't assert what you don't know, and don't look like you're just trying to grab a hold of the current cause du jour. This is a huge problem for the country, but you're acting on behalf of a huge problem for the country. So it's not like it's got to be an either-or issue. Right. And so, no, I'd stay focused on it. And if the research nerds come up and say, yes, there's definitive evidence, then I'd change. But until they do, I'd keep it simple.
That's how we lovingly refer to the people we relied on when we were doing campaign.
Nerds. Propeller heads.
Yeah. The one thing about the opioid crisis, though, that is similar is that it is ripping through all kinds of communities. Mm-hmm. And it, again, goes back to the fundamental point we began with, which is our common humanity. Mm-hmm. And, we've got to also make clear to people that this isn't about someone else or some other community or some other family, because, God forbid, you just don't know.
Right.
And any family can be touched by this, just as any family can be touched by other illnesses. And so, just stressing our common interests and our common concerns is important.
Well, I want to say a heartfelt thank you to both of you. And here are the lifesavers that are your payment for the afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you. I told you shouldn't let me negotiate for us on this.
Yeah. Heck of a deal, man. 5 flavors, hard candy. I got it.
So all of our chapters around the nation would be happy to host you at any time. We have walks in your communities, Chicago, Texas, D.C. The overnight walk, the Out of the Darkness overnight walk. We start at sunset and we walk overnight. Is this Saturday in D.C.? We have a bunch of people here.
Not going to be here, sorry.
Oh, too bad. Oh, too bad. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Sharing your stories.
Thank you for what you all are doing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.